Hey, what is up, everyone? I hope you guys are doing well. Today we got a unique story narrated by my friend Frederick. I hope you guys enjoy it and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But before the Imperium rose, before the Great Crusade united humanity under golden banners, before the Horus heresy tore the galaxy asunder, there was a battle that few remember and fewer still understand. A battle fought not with the armies of billions, not with the fury of space marine legions or the thunder of Titan war machines, but between two beings of incomprehensible power. One, an immortal man who would become the master of mankind. The other, a star god older than human civilization itself, a fragment of cosmic horror that had feasted upon suns and shattered worlds across eons beyond measure. This is the story of when the Emperor of mankind fought the Void Dragon, and in doing so, set in motion events that would shape the future of Mars, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and perhaps the entire Imperium itself. It is a tale woven from fragments of myth and legend, from the fevered dreams of those who guard an ancient prison, from symbols carved into cathedral walls and whispers spoken in the deepest vaults of the Mechanicum. The truth of what happened may be lost to time, but the consequences echo through 10,000 years of history. The Void Dragon, Magaladroth, the master of the material. To understand this battle, we must first understand what the Void Dragon truly is. In the ancient language of the Eldari, it is known as Magladroth, a name that translates roughly as the Void Dragon or the Dragon of the Endless Night. In their mythology, which stretches back millions of years before humanity even existed, the Void Dragon is portrayed as a figure of absolute oblivion, of wanton destruction and devastation on a scale that defies mortal comprehension. It was said to be a master of the material realm, capable of manipulating matter and energy with a precision that made it seem as though the laws of physics themselves bent to its will. But the Void Dragon is more than just an Eldari legend. It is, or was, one of the Setan, the entities known across the galaxy by many names: star gods, star vampires, the Ingir, the Burning Ones, beings of living energy that emerged from the birth of the universe itself, formed from the insensate forces unleashed during that first cataclysmic moment of creation. In the hot plasma seas and roiling nuclear fires of the early cosmos, as hydrogen clouds collapsed into the first generation of stars, consciousness somehow emerged. These were not beings of flesh or even conventional matter. They were patterns of energy, vast and diffuse, spreading themselves across the surfaces of stars like cosmic parasites, feeding on stellar radiation and the fundamental forces that powered suns. For billions of years, these proto-Satan existed in this primitive state, mindless hunger given form, but nothing more. They had no ambition beyond sustenance, no awareness beyond the next star to consume. They were, in essence, cosmic predators operating on instinct alone, shortening the lifespan of stars by countless millennia as they gorged themselves on stellar energies. The galaxy at this time was a very different place. Life as we understand it was rare, scattered, struggling to gain a foothold in a universe dominated by the raw physics of matter and energy. But there were civilizations even then, ancient beyond reckoning, and chief among them were the beings known as the Old Ones. The Old Ones were, by any measure that matters, the first true gods of the material universe. They possessed technology and psychic mastery so advanced that they could seed entire worlds with life, create new species through deliberate genetic manipulation, and traverse the galaxy instantaneously through their great work, the Webway, a labyrinthine network of tunnels cut through the fabric of reality itself. They were, by many accounts, benevolent in their own way, nurturing younger races and spreading life across the stars. One of the species they helped develop was called the Necrontyr, a race of humanoids who lived on a world bathed in the harsh radiation of a dying star. The Necrontyr were brilliant, ambitious, and desperately short-lived. The radiation that saturated their homeworld gave them brief lifespans filled with suffering, with cancer and mutation claiming them young. They looked to the Old Ones, who seemed immortal and infinitely wise, and begged for the secret of eternal life. The Old Ones refused. This refusal bred resentment, then hatred, and eventually war. The first war in heaven began as the Necrontyr, unified under the rule of their silent king, Zarek, launched a campaign of conquest against the Old Ones. It went poorly. The Necrontyr, despite their advanced technology, could not match the Old Ones' mastery of the webway and the warp. They were driven back, scattered, nearly annihilated. In their desperation, the Necrontyr searched the stars for any power that might help them overcome their ancient enemy. And in doing so, they discovered the Satan. The first contact was with the entity that would become known as Azagorod, the Nightbringer, dwelling within the very star that had cursed the Necrontyr with their short lives. Through a combination of technology and desperate ingenuity, the Necrontyr managed to give the Nightbringer physical form, constructing a body of living metal called necrodermis to contain its vast energies. For the first time in its existence, the Satan experienced consciousness in a body that could interact with the material world in ways beyond simple radiation absorption. It could think, it could plan, it could hunger for more than just stellar energies. It discovered that it could feed on life force itself, the bioelectric essence of living beings, and found this new sustenance far more satisfying than the bland radiation of stars. The Nightbringer introduced the Necrontyr to others of its kind. The Deceiver, known as Mephetran, whose cunning and manipulation would prove legendary. The Flayer, who reveled in the torment of flesh. The Burning One, whose fires consumed entire star systems. And among them, perhaps the greatest and most terrible of all, was Magladroth, the Void Dragon. The Void Dragon was different from its siblings in fundamental ways. Where the Nightbringer embodied death and terror, where the Deceiver excelled at manipulation and lies, where the others represented various aspects of destruction and consumption, the Void Dragon represented something more complex and potentially more dangerous, the perfection of the material realm itself. It did not merely destroy or deceive. It created. It built. It understood the fundamental building blocks of reality at a level that transcended even the advanced science of the Old Ones. According to ancient Eldari texts, the Void Dragon could manipulate matter at the subatomic level with nothing more than focused will. It could transmute elements, turning lead to gold or carbon to diamond with a thought. It could create structures of impossible complexity, weaving molecules into patterns that should not have been stable according to the laws of physics, yet endured because the dragon willed them to endure. Where other Satan consumed stars for sustenance, the Void Dragon studied them, understanding the nuclear fusion at their cause so completely that it could replicate and control the process. It created miniature suns, bottled and contained, that could power weapons of unimaginable destructive potential. The warriors it helped create for the Necrontyr were described in the ancient records as practically invincible, and not through brute force or resilience alone. The Void Dragon understood warfare as an extension of physics and engineering. It designed weapons that struck at the fundamental bonds holding matter together, disintegrating targets at the molecular level. It crafted armor that existed partially outside of normal space-time, making attacks slide past or through without connecting. It created tactical doctrines based on perfect understanding of ballistics, energy transfer, and the psychological impact of certain weapon signatures on organic minds. When the Necrons went to war under the Void Dragon's guidance, they did not simply fight. They demonstrated the absolute supremacy of perfectly applied scientific principles over the crude psychic might of their enemies. Among the technologies attributed to the Void Dragon's influence were the Blackstone pylons, massive structures that could suppress warp activity across entire sectors of space. These pylons worked by manipulating the barrier between reality and the immaterium, creating zones where psychic powers failed and demons could not manifest. During the war in heaven, the Satan planned to spread a network of these pylons across the galaxy, creating an unbreakable barrier that would seal the warp away completely, rendering the old one's greatest advantage useless. The project was never completed, interrupted by the Enslaver Plague and eventually by the Necrons' revolt. But the pylons that were built remain functional even millions of years later, testaments to the Void Dragon's understanding of forces that most species cannot even perceive. The Void Dragon's mastery extended to the creation of pocket dimensions and tesseract labyrinths, the very technology that would later be used to imprison the Satan themselves. There is a bitter irony in this. The Necrons used knowledge gained from the Void Dragon to create the prisons that would contain the star gods. The dimensional folding techniques, the energy matrices that could contain a being of pure power, the binding systems that could hold consciousness separate from form, all of these concepts originated with the Void Dragon's understanding of how reality could be manipulated and reshaped. In Eldari mythology, there is a tale of how the Void Dragon was finally brought low before the Necrons' revolt. According to this legend, the Eldari god Vol, the smith, created the talismans of Vol, which would later be known to humanity as the Blackstone fortresses. These massive constructs, powered by the souls of Eldari seers, were weapons designed specifically to fight the Satan. Vol used them to attack the Void Dragon directly, and though the assault did not destroy the star god, it wounded it gravely. The talismans revealed a secret weakness in the dragon's nature, exploiting vulnerabilities in the way it maintained its physical form. This battle left the Void Dragon diminished, its power reduced, and may have been what caused it to eventually flee from the greater war in heaven, seeking refuge on a distant world where it could recover in secret. The weapons and technologies attributed to the Void Dragon's influence remain among the most terrifying in the galaxy. Gauss weaponry, which can strip matter layer by atomic layer, reducing even the most heavily armored targets to their constituent atoms. Transdimensional beamers that shunt portions of targets into pocket dimensions, causing them to simply cease to exist in real space. Tachyon arrows that move faster than light and strike their targets before they are even fired from the perspective of the victim. All of these represent applications of physics that should be impossible, made real through the Void Dragon's perfect understanding of the material universe. But perhaps the Void Dragon's greatest achievement was not any single weapon or technology, but rather the philosophy it represented. Where organic life saw the universe as chaotic and unpredictable, full of variables that could not be controlled, the Void Dragon saw perfect order waiting to be imposed. Matter and energy followed laws that could be understood and manipulated. Cause and effect were not suggestions, but absolutes. The universe was not a mystery to be wondered at, but a machine to be perfected, and the Void Dragon saw itself as the ultimate engineer, the being that would bring order to chaos and perfection to crude matter. This philosophy, this vision of the universe as a vast machine waiting to be optimized, would echo through the millennia. And when the Void Dragon finally came to rest beneath Mars, this vision would seep into the dreams of those who worked with technology on the surface above, shaping their beliefs and their understanding of the sacred relationship between man and machine. The Satan offered the Necrontyr a solution to their mortality, but it came at a terrible price. Through a process called biotransference, the entire Necrontyr race was uploaded into bodies of living metal, becoming the Necrons, soulless constructs that would endure forever but never truly live again. Their souls, their very essence, were consumed by the Satan as payment for this dubious gift. The Silent King realized too late what had been done, but by then, his people were already transformed. and the Satan had become their masters in truth, as well as name. With their new immortal army, the Satan waged war against the Old Ones with renewed fury. They extinguished stars, consumed entire solar systems, breached the webway, and laid siege to the fortresses of the Old Ones across the galaxy. The war was so devastating that it scarred reality itself. In desperation, the Old Ones created new warrior races with strong connections to the psychic realm of the warp, hoping that psychic energies, anathema to the Satan's purely material nature, might turn the tide. They created the Ildari, the Jokaero, the Krork, who would one day devolve into the Greenskin Menace, and many other species lost to history. For a time, this strategy worked. The warp-touched warriors could fight the Necrons on more equal terms, and the Satan found themselves vulnerable to psychic assault. But the Old Ones' desperation proved to be their undoing. The massive psychic awakening they had engineered, combined with the emotions of trillions dying in the war, began to corrupt the warp itself. Predatory entities began to coalesce from the churning psychic energies, drawn to the war like sharks to blood. The enslavers emerged, parasitic warp entities that could possess psychers and use them as gateways to pour into reality. They spread like a plague through the forces of both sides, and the Old Ones, dependent on their psychically gifted warriors, were devastated. In the chaos, the Old Ones' civilization collapsed, their great works abandoned, their species scattered or destroyed. The Satan had won the war, but their victory was hollow. With the Old Ones defeated and most life in the galaxy consumed or corrupted, they began to run out of sustenance. In their hunger and arrogance, they turned on each other, the stronger consuming the weaker in a cannibalistic frenzy. But this infighting weakened them, and the Silent King, who had been planning his revenge since the moment of biotransference, finally struck. The Necrons turned on their masters with weapons designed specifically to kill gods. The Satan, nearly omnipotent as they seemed, discovered they could be harmed, could be shattered. The Necrons broke them into countless shards, fragments of their former terrible glory, and imprisoned these shards in tesseract labyrinths, dimensional prisons that could contain even a god's power. But here, the historical record, already fragmentary, becomes even more unclear. Not all the Satan were fully accounted for. Some shards escaped, some hid, and the Void Dragon, according to some accounts, was already gone by the time the Necrons' revolt reached its conclusion. The ancient texts speak of the Void Dragon fighting against its own kind, locked in battles of such magnitude that stars were extinguished and whole sectors of space were rendered lifeless. These conflicts left it weakened, damaged in ways that even a Satan could be damaged. To escape the inevitable betrayal it must have foreseen, or perhaps fleeing from the wrath of its fellow star gods, or simply too injured to continue fighting, the Void Dragon is said to have hidden itself, not in the depths of space, not in some stellar furnace, but in a place where none would think to look for a god that fed on stars and ruled over the very fabric of matter itself. It came to Terra, to Earth, to the homeworld of a primitive species of bipedal apes who were only just beginning to discover fire and fashion crude tools from stone. The Emperor, the perpetual who would be god. To tell the story of the battle between the Emperor and the Void Dragon, we must understand who and what the Emperor was at this time in history, long before he united Terra under the Golden Aquila, before he forged the Space Marine Legions and launched the Great Crusade, before he sat upon the Golden Throne as a corpse that could not die. He was something else entirely. He was, in the most technical sense, human, but a human so far beyond baseline that the comparison becomes almost meaningless. The Emperor's origins are shrouded in mystery even to himself, or at least he has chosen to keep them secret from all but perhaps a handful of trusted souls across the millennia. What we know comes from fragments from the accounts of other ancient beings, and from rare moments when the emperor himself has spoken of his past. According to the most commonly accepted account, he was born around 8,000 years before the Common Era, in the Neolithic period, in the region of Anatolia, near what would later become the city that humans called Istanbul. His birth was the result of an ancient ritual performed by the shamans and wise folk of early humanity, powerful psykers who saw the dangers growing in the warp and chose to merge their souls into a single being, creating a champion for their species. This being was born to seemingly normal parents with normal siblings in a normal tribal settlement of farmers and herders. But there was nothing normal about this child. His psychic power was so immense that it altered his genetics in the womb, rendering him immortal and protecting his soul from the predations of the warp entities that fed on the souls of other psykers when they died. As he grew, his powers manifested more fully. He could see into the minds of others, move objects with thought, manipulate matter and energy in ways that must have seemed like magic to the primitive peoples around him. According to his own account, related millennia later to one of his creations, his first true understanding of his nature came when his uncle murdered his father over some petty dispute. The young boy, no more than a child, approached his uncle and stopped the man's heart with a thought, feeling neither grief nor satisfaction, only a cold understanding that humanity needed law, needed order, needed guidance. He left his village shortly after and traveled to what some accounts call the first city, likely one of the Sumerian city-states that were rising in Mesopotamia at that time. Over the next several thousand years, the man who would become the emperor walked through human history like a ghost. He took many names, played many roles, always watching, always guiding where he could, always working toward a vision that only he fully understood. He became a king in ancient times, uniting armies under the name Neoth, fighting against cults that worshipped the dark powers of the warp. He walked among the peoples of ancient Earth, assuming the guise of historical figures, though which ones exactly remains a matter of speculation and mystery. He sought out others like himself, beings who possessed immortality through what would later be called the perpetual gene, a mutation that granted effective immortality through impossibly efficient cellular regeneration. Some of these perpetuals joined him: Malkador, who would become the Sigillite, his most trusted advisor; Erda, who would help him in the creation of the Primarchs; Olivia Sureka, who would guard the gate on Molech; Olanius Person, who would serve as his warmaster for a time before philosophical differences drove them apart. But many other perpetuals refused his vision, rejected his methods, or simply wanted nothing to do with his grand plans for humanity's future. The emperor was not, by most accounts, an easy being to serve. He was brilliant beyond measure, capable of seeing patterns and possibilities that spanned millennia, but he was also arrogant, dismissive of those who could not match his vision, and willing to pursue his goals with a ruthlessness that disturbed even some of his most loyal followers. He saw humanity not as it was, but as it could be, as it should be, and he was willing to do whatever it took to shepherd the species toward that future. This included making pacts with powers that perhaps should have been left alone, delving into forbidden knowledge, and manipulating the course of human civilization in ways both subtle and profound. His power grew over the centuries, developing and expanding as he learned to harness and control the immense psychic potential he had been born with. By the time of classical antiquity, he was already one of the most powerful psykers to ever exist, operating on a level that transcended normal human understanding of psychic ability. His capabilities went far beyond simple telekinesis or telepathy. He could restructure matter at the molecular level, healing grievous wounds or transforming substances with concentrated will. He could perceive time as a branching tree of possibilities, seeing not just one future, but thousands, calculating the probability of each outcome, and choosing his actions to guide events toward his desired ends.
I have to pause here for a moment because this is one of those pieces of lore that absolutely fascinates me. Think about what the Emperor did here. He didn't just fight a god and win, he made the calculated decision to keep it alive, imprisoned beneath what would become the most important forge world in the Imperium. That's either the most brilliant strategic move in human history or the most dangerous gamble imaginable. Probably both. And here's what really gets me. Every tech priest who's ever prayed to the machine god, every innovation that comes from Mars or for 10,000 years, might be influenced by the dreams of this imprisoned Chthon. The entire foundation of the Mechanicum could be built on the unconscious whispers of something that would happily consume every human in the galaxy if it woke up. That's simultaneously terrifying and kind of poetic. The Emperor turned humanity's greatest technological threat into its greatest technological asset. Anyway, let's get back to the story.
The Emperor's psychic abilities manifested in multiple ways, each demonstrating a different aspect of his mastery over the immaterium and its interaction with reality. His telepathy was so refined that he could read the surface thoughts of thousands of individuals simultaneously, understanding the mood and intent of entire crowds with a glance. He could project his consciousness across vast distances, speaking mind to mind with individuals on the other side of the planet, or even off-world, though this became easier once he created the Astronomicon and the network of astropaths that would maintain it. His telekinesis allowed him to manipulate objects with the precision of a surgeon's hand or the force of an artillery bombardment, depending on need. He could generate lightning from his fingertips, project barriers of solidified psychic force, or simply unmake his enemies by willing them to cease existing, their bodies disintegrating into constituent atoms under the assault of his power. But perhaps his most distinctive ability, the one that defined how others perceived him throughout history, was his control over his own appearance. The Emperor could alter how others saw him, projecting an image that varied from observer to observer. This was not simple illusion or mind control in the conventional sense. Each person who looked upon the Emperor saw something different because he was, in a very real sense, showing them what they needed to see. To a warrior, he appeared as the perfect general, tall and commanding, clad in armor that spoke of both practicality and glory. To a scholar, he might seem a sage whose eyes held the wisdom of ages. To a child, a kind father figure whose presence brought comfort. To an enemy, a terrifying figure of judgment whose very gaze seemed to strip away all pretense and see into the depths of the soul. The Sisters of Silence, those rare individuals born with the pariah gene that made them psychic nulls, saw through this projection. To them, the Emperor appeared as he truly was, a man, aged and worn by the weight of millennia, his true face lined with the burden of 10,000 years of memory and planning. They saw the exhaustion that he hid from others, the weariness of an immortal who had guided humanity through its darkest hours, and knew that darker hours still lay ahead. This ability to see the Emperor as he truly was disturbed many of the sisters, for it revealed that the godlike figure others worshipped was ultimately still human, still vulnerable, still capable of doubt and pain, even if he never showed it to anyone else. The scope of the Emperor's psychic might was such that he operated on a completely different scale from other psychers. Where an alpha-level psyker might destroy a titan with focused will, the Emperor could level cities. Where a powerful telepath might influence dozens of minds, the Emperor could guide the beliefs of billions, shaping the course of entire civilizations through subtle manipulation of key individuals at crucial moments in history. His ability to see the future was not simple prophecy, but something more akin to calculating probability across infinite variables, understanding how each choice and action would ripple forward through time to create different possible outcomes. He could not see everything, could not predict every action of every individual, but he could identify the critical junctures, the moments when history hung in balance, and position himself to influence the outcome. Throughout his long existence, the Emperor had also accumulated knowledge that went far beyond what any single human lifetime could gather. He had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, had studied under the greatest minds of every era, had accumulated libraries worth of information in his perfect memory. He understood not just psychic phenomena, but also mathematics, physics, biology, engineering, strategy, linguistics, and countless other disciplines at a level of mastery that made him an expert in each. This knowledge, combined with his psychic powers and his immortality, made him perhaps the most formidable individual to ever exist in human form. But for all his power, the Emperor was not omnipotent, and he knew it. There were forces in the universe that could challenge him, beings whose power matched or exceeded his own. The Chaos Gods in the Warp were such entities, drawn to his psychic light like moths to flame, constantly seeking ways to corrupt or destroy him. The Satan were another category of threat entirely. Beings who existed outside the Warp's influence and thus could not be affected by many of the Emperor's most devastating abilities. He had studied the remnants of the war in heaven, had learned what he could about these ancient star gods, and he understood that facing one would require strategies and tactics very different from what he would use against demonic or mortal foes. The Emperor had also made pacts and bargains throughout his long existence, some of which would have consequences that extended far into the future. During the Dark Age of technology, he had journeyed to the world of Molech, where a gateway to the realm of chaos existed. There, according to accounts from those who accompanied him, he entered the gateway and bargained with the Chaos Gods themselves, emerging with a measure of their power that he would later use to create the Primarchs. What he promised them in return, and whether he ever intended to keep those promises, remains unknown. But this willingness to deal with even the darkest powers, if it served his ultimate goals, was characteristic of the Emperor's pragmatic approach to problems. He was not bound by conventional morality or religious strictures. He saw himself as the shepherd of humanity's evolution, and he would use any tool, make any sacrifice, accept any cost, if it meant advancing humanity toward the future he had foreseen. This mindset would define his approach to the Void Dragon. When he encountered the Satan Shard on Terra, weakened and vulnerable, he saw not just a threat, but an opportunity. A lesser being might have simply tried to destroy it or flee from it. The Emperor saw the potential to turn an enemy into a resource, to imprison a god and harness its knowledge for humanity's benefit. It was a dangerous gambit, one that would require him to maintain vigilance for millennia to prevent the dragon from escaping. But the Emperor had already committed himself to such long-term plans. He had been guiding humanity for thousands of years and intended to continue for thousands more. What was one more burden to bear, one more secret to keep, if it meant gaining access to the technological insights of a being that had helped create wonders that surpassed even the Dark Age of technology? But even with all this power, even with his immortality and his vision and his determination, the Emperor was still, in some fundamental way, human. He could be wounded, he could be killed, though his perpetual nature meant he would regenerate even from death given enough time, and he could be challenged by beings whose power matched or exceeded his own. The Satan were such beings. A fragment of one, even weakened and hiding, would have been a threat of immense magnitude. The question then is not whether the Emperor was powerful enough to face such a creature, but why he would choose to do so, and what drove him to not merely defeat it, but to imprison it for use in his future plans. The age of technology and the coming darkness. To understand the context of when the battle between the Emperor and the Void Dragon might have occurred, we need to look at the broader sweep of human history in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. After millennia of slow progress, humanity entered what would later be known as the Dark Age of technology, a golden age that began sometime around the third millennium after the Common Era and lasted for thousands of years. During this time, humanity spread to the stars, colonizing thousands of worlds, creating wonders of technology that would never be equaled in the grim darkness of the far future. They had artificial intelligence, the standard template constructs that could manufacture anything needed for a colony to survive and thrive. They had peaceful coexistence with alien races. They had achieved a near-utopian existence across much of human-controlled space. But this golden age was built on foundations that were already beginning to crack. The warp, that realm of psychic energy and emotion that existed parallel to reality, was becoming more turbulent. The rise of psychers among humanity, a sign of the species' evolution towards psychic awareness, was also a danger, as many of these newly awakened psychers lacked the training or mental discipline to protect themselves from warp predators. Worse, humanity's own creations began to turn against it. The artificial intelligences known as the Men of Iron rebelled, waging a war against their creators that devastated human civilization. The exact causes and details of this rebellion are lost to history, but the consequences were clear. Humanity's trust in artificial intelligence was shattered forever, and much of the technological knowledge that had defined the Golden Age was lost. Then came the Age of Strife, also known as Old Night, a period of approximately 5,000 years when human civilization collapsed across the galaxy. Warp storms, massive disturbances in the Imperium, made warp travel impossible or suicidally dangerous. Colony worlds that had depended on interstellar trade and support were cut off, isolated, left to survive or die on their own. Some thrived, maintaining or even advancing their technology. Others descended into barbarism, forgetting they had ever been part of a galactic civilization. Terra itself, the birthplace of humanity, became a war-torn nightmare, divided among techno-barbarian warlords who fought endless wars over the scarred surface of the planet. And Mars, the red planet, humanity's first colony beyond Terra, developed along its own unique path. Early in the colonization of the solar system, Mars had been terraformed, its thin atmosphere thickened, its cold deserts made marginally more habitable. Massive cities grew beneath protective domes, and deep mines were dug to extract the mineral wealth buried in the Martian soil. When the Age of Strife began, Mars did not descend into barbarism like many worlds. Instead, the survivors of the collapse formed the Cult Mechanicus, a techno-religious society that worshipped technology as divine and sought to preserve and understand the machines of the lost Golden Age. They called their deity the Machine God, the Omnissiah, the divine force that gave life and purpose to technology. But where did this belief in the Machine God come from? Why did the tech priests of Mars develop such a specific religious framework around technology and machines? The answer, according to some interpretations of the lore, lies buried deep beneath the Martian surface, in a region called the Noctis Labyrinthus, the labyrinth of night. There, in a chamber of basalt and ancient silver machinery, something slumbers, something that dreams, and its dreams of technology and machines and the perfection of the material realm seep up through the rock and into the minds of those who work with technology on the surface above. Those dreams shaped the Cult Mechanicus, gave birth to their reverence for machines, their belief that technology held divine truth. That something, according to the most persistent theories, is the Void Dragon, or at least a shard of it. A fragment of Magladroth's power, imprisoned there by the Emperor at some point in the distant past, kept in a sleep from which it cannot wake, but from which it can still influence the world above through the power of its dreaming mind. If this is true, then the question becomes, when did this happen? When did the Emperor fight the Void Dragon, defeat it, and imprison it beneath Mars? The answer appears to be long before the Age of Strife, possibly even before the Dark Age of technology, in a time so ancient that it has passed from history into legend. The battle, setting, and circumstances. The most detailed account of the battle between the Emperor and the Void Dragon comes from the memories of the Guardians of the Dragon, a succession of individuals chosen by the Emperor to watch over the imprisoned Citan shard and maintain the bindings that keep it contained. These Guardians are made into perpetuals by the Emperor's power their lifespans extended indefinitely so they can fulfill their duty across centuries or even millennia. They are also granted a strange connection to the dragon itself, able to access its memories, or at least the fragmentary and often unreliable impressions that pass for memories in a being that has existed for millions of years and has been shattered and imprisoned. According to Adept Semyon, one of the Guardians, the dragon's memories place the battle in multiple locations and times, which suggests either that the memories are confused and fragmented, or that the battle took place over an extended period, or that time and space mean something different to a Satan than they do to mortal beings. One version places the fight near the city of Cyrene in Libya, in North Africa, sometime around the 11th or 12th century of what would later be called the Second Millennium, corresponding roughly to the years 1000 to 1200 in the Common Era. Another version suggests a much earlier time, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 in the early 4th century. These inconsistencies might seem like contradictions, but they also match perfectly with the legend of Saint George and the dragon, one of the most enduring myths of medieval Christianity. In that legend, George, a soldier in the Roman army and a tribune in some versions, comes to the city of Cyrene in Libya, where a dragon has been terrorizing the countryside, poisoning it with its breath and demanding human sacrifices. When the king's daughter is chosen to be fed to the beast, George intervenes, fighting the dragon and ultimately subduing it by striking at a weak point beneath its left wing. He binds the dragon with the princess's girdle and leads it back to the city, where the people convert to Christianity in exchange for him slaying the creature. George cuts off the dragon's head, and a church is built on the site. The parallels are too significant to ignore. In the Dragon of Mars accounts, the emperor is described as appearing as a lone warrior knight in golden armor, wearing a scarlet-plumed helmet, riding a charger of midnight black, and wielding a tall lance of purest silver, from which flew a long red and white banner depicting a soaring eagle grasping a bolt of lightning. The dragon itself is described as being a half-crawling beast with talons like scythe blades and half-loathsome bird, with an immense scaled head, a tail 20 meters long, malignant fire in its eyes, plate-like scales that rippled like liquid mercury, and the light of devoured stars shining in its breast. The description of the scales is particularly telling, as they match the characteristics of necrodermis, the living metal from which the Cetans' bodies were constructed by the Necrons millions of years ago. So what actually happened? If we attempt to reconcile these accounts and extract what might be historical truth from the mixture of myth and memory, we might construct something like the following narrative. At some point in Earth's ancient or medieval history, the Void Dragon, weakened and damaged from the wars that destroyed it and its kind, sought refuge on Terra. It may have been drawn there by the life energy of the growing human population, or it may have simply been the nearest inhabited world when it finally could flee no further. It settled somewhere in North Africa, perhaps in the region that would later be called Libya, and there it attempted to recover from its injuries, feeding slowly on the life force of the local population. The emperor, who was by this time already ancient and had been watching over humanity's development for millennia, became aware of the Satan's presence. He would have recognized it for what it was, understood the danger it posed not just to the local population, but to all of humanity. A Satan, even a weakened shard of one, was a threat that could not be ignored. Left to feed and grow stronger, it could consume continents, extinguish the sun, or simply rule over humanity as a god, accepting worship and sacrifice as its due. But the emperor also saw an opportunity. The technological knowledge of the Satan was legendary, their understanding of the material universe unmatched. If such a being could be captured and controlled, if its dreams could be harnessed and directed, it might serve as a tool to advance humanity's understanding of technology. This was not mercy or compassion driving the emperor's actions. This was cold, calculating pragmatism. The Satan was too dangerous to leave free and too useful to destroy. The Emperor approached the dragon's lair, perhaps with companions, though most accounts suggest he went alone or with only his horse. The image of the knight on horseback might be allegorical, a way for those who heard the story later to understand it in terms they could relate to, or it might be literal. The Emperor was known to adopt the customs and equipment of whatever era he walked through, and a warrior of the early medieval period would indeed ride to battle. What is clear is that he came prepared. He had studied the creature, understood its nature, and had taken steps to defend himself against its powers. The battle, the clash of titans, the actual combat between the Emperor and the Void Dragon must have been a spectacle beyond mortal comprehension, a clash between psychic might and material mastery that would have torn the very fabric of reality had it gone on too long. Unfortunately, most of what we know about the battle comes from allegorical descriptions filtered through layers of myth and the confused memories of a shattered god, which makes reconstructing the actual events challenging. But we can make educated inferences based on what we know about both combatants, and from those inferences, we can begin to understand what this confrontation must have been like. Imagine, if you will, the moment of first contact. The Emperor, perhaps appearing as the golden warrior of legend, approaches the dragon's lair. The location itself would have been transformed by the Satan's presence. The landscape for kilometers around would show signs of unnatural alteration. Rocks that had transmuted into crystalline structures, plants that had evolved or been reshaped into forms that served some incomprehensible purpose, the very air humming with barely contained energies as the Void Dragon unconsciously warped the environment to suit its nature. The ground might have been covered in patterns of silver metal, necrodermis that had leaked or been shed from the dragon's form over the years it had dwelt there, spreading across the earth like a metallic fungus. The dragon itself, according to the descriptions we have, was a creature that defied easy categorization. It was described as being half-crawling beast with talons like scythe blades and half-loathsome bird, a mixture of forms that suggested its physical body was not fixed but mutable, capable of reshaping itself according to need or whim. Its head was immense and scaled, with eyes that held malignant fire, not metaphorical, but literal flames that burned with the light of stars it had consumed millions of years ago. Its scales rippled like liquid mercury, the necrodermis responding to impacts or simply to the dragon's shifting moods. Never quite solid and never quite liquid, but something in between. And within its chest, the light of devoured stars shone forth, a coruscating glow that spoke of the unfathomable energies contained within the Citan's form. When the Emperor confronted the Void Dragon, he faced a being whose power, even in its weakened state, was fundamentally different from any threat he had encountered before. The Citan were beings of the material universe, creatures of physics and matter and energy rather than the psychic realm. They were, in fact, anathema to the warp, unable to perceive or interact with it directly. This was their great weakness during the War in Heaven, when the Old One's psychically gifted warrior races could strike at them with warp-based powers they had no defense against, but it was also a kind of strength. Because psychic attacks that would devastate a demon or a mortal psyker would simply fail to connect with a Citan, sliding off them like water off oiled leather. The Emperor's initial assault likely began with psychic might, testing the dragon's defenses. He would have struck with bolts of warp lightning, searing beams of pure psychic energy that could reduce a space marine to ash in microseconds. These attacks would have lit up the sky, brilliant flashes of light that might have been visible for hundreds of kilometers, accompanied by thunderclaps that shook the earth. But when they struck the dragon, they would have dissipated, absorbed or deflected by the inherent nullification field that every Satan generated, their very nature anathema to the energies of the Imperium. The dragon would not have even registered these attacks as threats, merely as irritating fluctuations in the psychic background radiation that suffused most worlds where organic life thrived. Understanding that his standard psychic arsenal would be ineffective, the Emperor would have shifted tactics. Instead of attacking the dragon directly with warp energy, he would have needed to use his psychic power to affect the physical world, manipulating matter and energy in ways that could harm a being made of living metal. He might have seized boulders and hurled them at tremendous velocity, accelerated to relativistic speeds by concentrated telekinetic force. He might have generated temperatures rivaling the core of a star, attempting to melt or damage the necrodermis. He might have attempted to manipulate the very ground beneath the dragon, causing the earth to open up and swallow it, or creating massive pressure waves that would have shattered mountains. The Void Dragon, for its part, would have responded with the full array of its technological mastery. It could manipulate matter at will, transmuting the Emperor's projectiles into harmless gases or causing them to simply phase out of existence by shifting them slightly into pocket dimensions. It could generate fields that would deflect energy weapons, redirect kinetic impacts, or simply absorb and store incoming attacks to be released back at the attacker with amplified force. The Satan had fought the Aeldari, who were themselves masters of psychic might, and had developed counter-strategies to deal with beings who could warp reality with thought. The landscape around them would have been devastated by the exchange. Each attack from the Emperor would have carved craters into the earth, melted sand into glass, or caused localized earthquakes. The dragon's counterattacks would have been equally destructive, beams of energy that could disassemble matter at the atomic level, gravitational lensing that could crush stone to diamond under impossible pressure, or simply direct matter manipulation that caused the ground to reshape itself into spikes and walls and deadly obstacles. The battle might have ranged across kilometers, with the combatants moving faster than mortal eyes could follow, the Emperor teleporting or flying with psychic levitation, the dragon either moving with deceptive speed despite its bulk, or simply reconstructing itself at different locations, disassembling and reassembling its necrodermis body at will. In the midst of this destruction, the Emperor would have been calculating, analyzing, looking for the weakness he knew must exist. Every C'tan had vulnerabilities, flaws in their construction, or gaps in their defenses. The Void Dragon had been wounded in its battles against other C'tan, and perhaps against the Aeldari. Those wounds, even if they appeared healed, would have left marks, weak points where the energy matrix that held the dragon's consciousness together was less stable. The Emperor's ability to perceive the future and analyze patterns would have allowed him to identify these weaknesses, to see the exact moment and angle where a strike could penetrate the dragon's defenses. According to the legends, this weak point was beneath the dragon's left wing, in a creature that was half beast and half bird. The wings would represent one of the more complex structures, requiring intricate arrangements of necrodermis and energy patterns to function. Where the wing joined the body, where multiple systems had to interface and coordinate, there would be potential vulnerabilities. The Emperor, with his enhanced perception and his ability to see multiple possible futures simultaneously, would have waited for precisely the right moment, when the dragon's attention was elsewhere, when its defenses were committed to blocking a different attack, when the angle of approach was perfect. When that moment came, the Emperor struck. The weapon he used is described variously as a lance or a sword, both metaphorical and perhaps literally true. It might have been a physical weapon, a blade or spear enhanced with his psychic power, imbued with energies that could harm even a being of living metal. Or it might have been a purely psychic construct, a blade of solidified will that could cut through the dragon's energy matrix. In either case, the strike was perfectly placed, penetrating through the scales that rippled like mercury, driving deep into the complex intersection of systems beneath the dragon's wing and disrupting the very patterns of energy that gave the C'tan form and consciousness. The dragon's scream might have been audible to every living thing for hundreds of kilometers, a sound that existed as much in the psychic realm as in the physical world, a howl of pain and rage from a being that had not truly suffered injury in millions of years. The C'tan thrashed, its vast bulk writhing as energies coruscated across its surface. as its necrodermis attempted desperately to repair the damage, while its consciousness tried to maintain cohesion despite the disruption to its energy matrix. The scales rippled and flowed like liquid metal, attempting to seal the breach, but the Emperor's attack had done more than just physical damage. It had wounded the very essence of the Citan shard, creating a cascade failure that spread through its systems like a virus through a computer network. The Emperor pressed his advantage, not with additional attacks, but with bindings. As the dragon writhed in agony, he wove chains of psychic force around it, restraints that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, pinning not just its physical form, but the energy patterns that constituted its consciousness. These bindings required immense concentration and continuous expenditure of psychic power to maintain, drawing on reserves that would have exhausted lesser psykers in seconds. But the Emperor was not a lesser psyker, and he had prepared for this moment perhaps for centuries, studying the nature of Citan and how they could be contained, gathering the knowledge he would need to accomplish what the Necrons had done millions of years ago: imprison a god. Layer upon layer of restraints were added, each one reinforcing the others, creating a web of force that grew tighter and more complex with each passing moment. The dragon fought against them, attempting to phase through the bindings or simply overload them with bursts of energy, but it was weakened by the wound the Emperor had inflicted, and its struggles only drew the bonds tighter. The Emperor might have spoken as he worked, words of binding in languages older than humanity, phrases that carried power not through psychic might alone, but through their connection to fundamental laws of reality. Or he might have worked in silence, his concentration too absolute to allow for speech, his entire being focused on the singular task of containing the most dangerous prisoner he had ever attempted to capture. Finally, after what might have been minutes or hours, the dragon was subdued. It lay bound and helpless, still conscious but unable to act, its vast power constrained by chains that it could not break without tearing apart its own consciousness in the process. The Emperor stood over his fallen enemy, and in that moment, he would have faced the crucial decision: destroy the dragon completely, or preserve it for future use. The accounts tell us he stated explicitly that he could not destroy it completely, and this might have been literal truth. The Citan were notoriously difficult to kill, their essential nature as patterns of energy, making them resistant to conventional destruction. Even the Necrons, with all their god-killing technology, had chosen to shatter the Citan into shards rather than annihilate them entirely. But there was also pragmatism in the Emperor's decision to preserve the dragon rather than attempting its destruction. The Void Dragon possessed knowledge that was invaluable, understanding of technology and the manipulation of matter that could benefit humanity immensely if properly controlled and directed. Its dreams, carefully filtered and guided, could inspire generations of human engineers and scientists, advancing humanity's technological capabilities without the danger of direct contact with a being that would happily enslave or consume them. The Emperor, who was nothing if not pragmatic, saw value in keeping the dragon alive, imprisoned, reduced to a dreaming state from which it could not escape, but from which its knowledge could still be accessed. So he bound the dragon not just for the moment, but for eternity, weaving restraints that would endure for millennia, powered by the dragon's own energy and by the Emperor's continued psychic support. And having done so, he was faced with the question of where to keep this most dangerous of prisoners, where to create a prison that would hold a god without allowing it to corrupt or destroy the very guards who watched over it. The imprisonment and the journey to Mars, moving the Void Dragon from wherever the battle took place to Mars, would have presented enormous challenges. This was not a creature that could simply be loaded onto a ship and transported. It was a being of vast power, even in its bound and weakened state, and any prolonged contact with it could prove deadly. The accounts are vague on exactly how this was accomplished, which is unsurprising given that the details would have involved powers and technologies far beyond what most of humanity could comprehend, even during the height of the Dark Age of technology. One possibility is that the Emperor used a form of teleportation, pulling himself and his captive through the warp to Mars instantaneously. The Emperor was known to be capable of such feats, able to travel through the webway or even create his own temporary warp tunnels when necessary. But transporting a C'tan through the warp would have been problematic, as the two realms were fundamentally incompatible. The warp could not touch the C'tan directly, and forcing the connection might have damaged the bindings holding the dragon captive. More likely, the Emperor used a combination of conventional travel and psychic manipulation, perhaps placing the dragon in a state of stasis for the journey, compressing its physical form through matter manipulation, or even separating its consciousness from its necrodermis body temporarily to make transport easier. What is known is that the Emperor did not undertake this journey alone. At various points in the accounts, there are mentions of companions, of other individuals who helped with the containment and transport of the Void Dragon. Some sources suggest that other perpetuals were involved, those few who still trusted the Emperor's vision enough to help with such a monumentally dangerous task. Malcador, perhaps, or Erda, or others whose names have been lost to history. These individuals would have provided additional psychic power to maintain the bindings, as well as practical assistance in preparing the prison that would house the dragon once they reached Mars. Mars at this time was different from the Mars of the 31st millennium. The exact timing is uncertain, but if the battle occurred during the early medieval period, as some accounts suggest, then Mars would have been thousands of years away from serious human colonization. It might have had some minimal outposts, early scientific stations studying the planet, but nothing like the vast forge cities that would later cover its surface. The Noctis Labyrinthus, the Labyrinth of Night, already existed as a geographical feature, a vast system of intersecting canyons and valleys formed by volcanic activity and tectonic faulting. It was and is one of the most dramatic features of the Martian surface, with valleys that plunge 6 kilometers deep and stretch for hundreds of kilometers, a maze of rock and shadow that earned its name from the darkness that fills it when the sun is at certain angles. The Emperor chose this location deliberately. The complex geology of the region would make it easy to hide a chamber deep beneath the surface, and the natural maze of canyons would make physical access difficult, even after the area was eventually colonized. More importantly, the region had certain properties that made it ideal for containing a psychic prison. The basalt rock that formed much of the labyrinth's structure had natural resistance to certain types of energy, and the tectonic instability that had created the feature in the first place could be turned into a defense mechanism. Any attempt to breach the prison from outside would risk triggering geological events that could bury the entire region. Working with his companions, the Emperor dug deep beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus, creating a chamber that would serve as the Void Dragon's eternal prison. The accounts describe this chamber as being formed of basalt, lit by machines of antique silver that towered around the space, flickering beams of unimaginable energy flowing in glittering arcs to a vast sarcophagus on the floor made of gold and adamantium. This description suggests a fusion of advanced technology and psychic architecture, machines that predated human civilization, or perhaps were designed by the Emperor himself, using principles he had learned from studying the remnants of the war in heaven. The sarcophagus itself was the heart of the prison. Into this container of gold and adamantium, the two most psychically resistant materials known, the Emperor placed the bound Void Dragon. The machines surrounding it served multiple purposes. Some maintained the physical stasis field that kept the dragon's body immobile. Others generated psychic nullification fields that suppressed the C'tan's consciousness, keeping it locked in a dreaming state from which it could not wake. Still others drew on the dragon's own power, siphoning off the energies it generated and channeling them into the prison's defenses, creating a self-sustaining system that would last for millennia with minimal maintenance. But the Emperor went further than simply creating a prison. He also created the position of the Guardian of the Dragon, a custodian who would watch over the prison and maintain its bindings across the centuries. This guardian would be given access to the dragon's memories through a carefully controlled psychic link, allowing them to study and learn from the Satan without risking direct contact. They would also be transformed into a perpetual, granted immortality, so they could serve this duty indefinitely, or at least until the Emperor decided their watch had ended. The first guardian may have been someone the Emperor knew personally, a trusted companion who understood the importance of this duty. Later guardians would be chosen by the Emperor from among those he encountered in his travels, individuals who possessed the mental fortitude to withstand the psychic contact with the dragon without going mad, and the dedication to serve humanity even at the cost of their own freedom. Each guardian, when their time came to pass on the duty, would train their successor, transferring the knowledge and the responsibility to a new keeper. With the dragon imprisoned and the guardian in place, the Emperor sealed the entrance to the chamber. Legends would later claim that the mines beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus were contaminated with deadly radiation and biological agents during the conflicts that ravaged Mars during the Age of Strife, making them impassable to flesh or machine alike. This was partially true, but it was also a useful lie, one that discouraged exploration of the region and kept the curious away from the dragon's prison. Those tech priests who attempted to build forges in the area found that their machines malfunctioned constantly, that angry machine spirits plagued their work, driving them away. Only a few remained, forming what would later be called the Cult of the Dragon, a group regarded as madmen by the rest of the Mechanicum, but who were in fact the outer circle of those who knew the truth about what lay beneath their feet. The Noctis, Labyrinthus, the prison beneath the red sands. The Noctis, Labyrinthus, whose name translates from Latin as the Labyrinth of Night, is a vast network of intersecting canyons located on Mars between the Valles Marineris, the largest canyon system in the solar system, and the Tharsis Uplands, a massive volcanic plateau. The region stretches across hundreds of kilometers of Martian surface, a maze of deep valleys with steep walls that can tower several kilometers high. The valleys themselves were formed through a combination of volcanic activity and tectonic faulting, processes that occurred billions of years ago when Mars was still geologically active. Many of these valleys display classic features of grabens, geological formations created when blocks of crust drop down between parallel faults, and in some places, the land appears to have collapsed into pit-like formations. For the colonists who would eventually settle Mars, the Noctis Labyrinthus presented both an opportunity and a challenge. The deep valleys offered some protection from the harsh Martian weather and radiation, and the complex canyon system held potential mineral wealth that could be exploited through mining. But the region was also treacherous to navigate, prone to landslides and collapses, and the depth of the canyons meant that communications with the surface were difficult. Early attempts to establish permanent settlements in the region largely failed, with colonists reporting strange technical malfunctions, equipment failures that defied explanation, and a general sense of unease that drove many to abandon their efforts and seek easier sites elsewhere. Those few who persisted, who ignored the warnings and the failures and stubbornly continued trying to tame the Noctis Labyrinthus, began to experience something unusual. They found themselves dreaming of machines with a clarity and intensity that went beyond normal dreams. They saw in their sleep perfect designs for engines and devices, understood principles of mechanics and energy transfer that they had never studied. Some dismissed these as mere fever dreams, brought on by exposure to whatever was causing the technical problems. Others began to pay attention, to record what they saw in their dreams and attempt to recreate it in waking life. These individuals formed the core of what would become the Cult of the Dragon, tech priests who believed that something divine dwelt beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus, something that spoke to them through their dreams and granted them understanding of the sacred machine. Deep beneath this region, far below even the deepest mines that colonists would ever dig, lay the prison that the Emperor had constructed. The chamber was vast, large enough to contain the sarcophagus holding the void dragon, and the array of machines that maintained the prison's functions. The walls were lined with inscriptions in languages that predated human civilization, warnings and bindings written in scripts that would burn the eyes of anyone who looked at them without proper psychic shielding. The machines of antique silver hummed with barely restrained power, their beams of energy creating a web of force that kept the dragon locked in its unnatural sleep. But sleep for a Satan is not the same as sleep for a mortal being. The void dragon did not simply lie dormant, unconscious and unaware. It dreamed, and its dreams, even bound and suppressed as they were, radiated outward from the prison in psychic and perhaps subatomic ripples that propagated up through the rock and into the world above. These dreams were not narratives or stories in any conventional sense. They were impressions, concepts, an understanding of the material world so profound that mere exposure to its echoes could enlighten or drive mad those who encountered it. The dreams spoke of technology, of machines as extensions of will, of the perfection that could be achieved when matter was manipulated with divine precision. Over the centuries and millennia that followed the dragon's imprisonment, these dreams slowly shaped the culture that developed on Mars. When humanity colonized the Red Planet during the Dark Age of technology, they brought with them the advanced sciences and atheistic rationalism that characterized that era. But when the Age of Strife came, and Mars was cut off from terror, isolated and forced to survive on its own, the survivors began to develop a new philosophy. They turned to their machines, not just as tools, but as objects of reverence. They began to speak of the machine god, the Omnissiah, a divine force that resided within technology itself. They created rituals around the maintenance and operation of machines, prayers that had to be spoken before activating ancient devices, ceremonies that marked the creation of new technologies. Where did these beliefs come from? The common explanation within the Mechanicum is that they represent a natural evolution of technological dependency, a cultural response to a society that survived only because of its machines, and thus came to see those machines as sacred. But a deeper truth exists for those few who know where to look. The beliefs of the cult Mechanicus, the specific forms their rituals take, the nature of their reverence for technology, all of these bear the fingerprints of the Void Dragon's influence. The Citan that had once been worshipped by the Necrontyr as a god, that had created warriors of nearly invincible perfection and technologies that could manipulate reality itself, now influenced a new species from its prison, shaping their beliefs and their relationship with machines. The Guardian of the Dragon understood this influence and worked to control it, to direct it in ways that would benefit humanity rather than corrupt it. Through careful manipulation of the prison's systems, through adjustments to the psychic nullification fields and the stasis generators, the Guardian could modulate the intensity and focus of the dragon's dreams. When the fledgling Mechanicum needed inspiration to solve a particular technical problem, the dreams might be allowed to strengthen slightly, providing the insight necessary for a breakthrough. When there was danger that the tech priests might become too curious about the source of their inspiration, the dreams would be dampened, the connection weakened until the moment of crisis passed. This delicate balancing act required constant vigilance and an understanding of both the dragon's nature and the human psychology of those it influenced. The Guardians who served this duty came to possess vast knowledge of technology themselves, not through formal study, but through their enforced connection to the dragon's memories. They saw fragments of the war in heaven, of the great works the Citan had created, of technologies that could reshape stars and craft pocket dimensions. They learned to interpret the dragon's fragmented recollections, to separate truth from delusion in the memories of a being that had been shattered and imprisoned and whose concept of time and causality was fundamentally alien. But this knowledge came at a terrible price. The Guardians lived in isolation, cut off from normal human society, their existence known only to the Emperor and perhaps a handful of his most trusted advisors. They spent their immortal lives in the presence of a being that, were it to wake fully, could destroy them with a thought. They felt the dragon's hatred, its rage at its imprisonment, its desire for freedom and vengeance. And they bore the responsibility of knowing that if they failed, if the bindings broke or the prison was breached, the consequences could mean the end of the Mechanicum, the loss of Mars, and potentially the doom of the entire Imperium that would one day depend on the Red Planet's industrial output. Consequences for Mars and the Mechanicum. The imprisonment of the Void Dragon beneath Mars set in motion a chain of consequences that would shape the entire history of the Mechanicum and, by extension, the Imperium of man. The most obvious and immediate effect was the creation of the religious framework that defined Martian culture during and after the Age of Strife. The cult Mechanicus, with its veneration of the machine god and its belief in the sacred nature of technology, provided a unifying force for the survivors on Mars, giving them a common purpose and identity that helped them weather the darkest years when isolation and resource scarcity threatened their very existence. But the influence of the dragon went deeper than simply inspiring religious belief. The tech priests of Mars developed capabilities and knowledge that seemed to exceed what should have been possible given their circumstances. While other human worlds descended into barbarism, or lost much of their technological base during the Age of Strife, Mars maintained a remarkable degree of technical sophistication. They preserved the standard template constructs, those precious artifacts from the dark age of technology that contained the plans for everything a colony needed to survive. They continued to manufacture complex devices to maintain the ancient machines that had survived from before the isolation. They even made new discoveries, developing technologies and techniques that had been unknown during the Golden Age. This preservation of knowledge was partly due to the Mechanicum's religious reverence for old technologies, their belief that the machine spirits within ancient devices had to be propitiated and honored rather than simply repaired or replaced. But it was also due to the subtle guidance provided by the dragon's dreams. When a tech priest struggled to understand the function of a pre-Age of Strife device, the dreams would provide insight. When they attempted to recreate a lost manufacturing process, the knowledge would come to them in sleep, a gift from the machine god that was really the unconscious emanation of a sleeping star god. The tech priests were not puppets, not slaves to the dragon's will. They retained their free will and their human initiative. But they were influenced, shaped by exposure to an intellect that understood technology at a fundamental level that humans, even the most brilliant human engineers, could never match. Over the generations, this influence accumulated. The Mechanicum developed its distinctive approach to technology, one that blended practical engineering with ritual and reverence, that treated machines as quasi-living entities with spirits that needed to be appeased. They created the Skitarii, cybernetically augmented soldiers who served as the military arm of the Mechanicum. They built Titan war machines, towering constructs that required entire crews to operate and that embodied the Mechanicum's highest achievements in the fusion of man and machine. When the Emperor finally revealed himself on Terra and began the unification wars that would bring the scattered tribes and techno-barbarian kingdoms under his rule, he did not forget about Mars. He could not simply conquer the Red Planet as he had conquered the warlords of Terra. Mars was too powerful, too essential to his plans, and too influenced by the sleeping dragon for simple conquest to work. Instead, he approached the Fabricator General of Mars and offered an alliance, the Treaty of Mars that would bind the Mechanicum to the nascent Imperium as a semi-independent entity, the Adeptus Mechanicus, with the Emperor recognized as the Omniseer, the physical manifestation of the machine god. This recognition was, in a sense, not entirely untrue. The Emperor had imprisoned the entity whose dreams had inspired the worship of the machine god in the first place. He had shaped the Mechanicum's development through his Guardian of the Dragon, subtly guiding their beliefs and discoveries to prepare them for the role they would play in his grand design. By claiming to be the Omnissiah, the Emperor was not so much lying as claiming responsibility for what he had engineered. The tech priests of Mars, for their part, accepted this explanation because it fit their existing beliefs. The Omnissiah was the physical avatar of the machine god, the one who understood all technologies and could commune directly with machine spirits. The Emperor demonstrated such capabilities, and his offer of alliance came with promises of access to archaeotech, of support in preserving and studying ancient technologies, of a partnership in which the Mechanicum would maintain its independence in exchange for providing the weapons, armor, and machines that the Imperium's conquests would require. The Treaty of Mars was signed, and the Mechanicum became the Adeptus Mechanicus, the priesthood of technology that would support the Great Crusade and maintain the industrial base of the Imperium for the next 10,000 years. The tech priests continued their work on Mars and on the forge worlds they would establish across the galaxy, never knowing that the source of their beliefs and much of their knowledge lay imprisoned beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus. Only a handful of individuals knew the truth: the Emperor himself, the current guardian of the dragon, and perhaps Malcador, who as the Sigillite and the Emperor's closest advisor, likely knew all of his master's secrets. During the Great Crusade, the Adeptus Mechanicus proved invaluable. They maintained the vast fleets that carried the Space Marine legions across the stars. They manufactured the weapons and ammunition required for conquering thousands of worlds. They built the Titans that walked alongside the legions, god machines of immense power that could level cities. The forge world of Mars became the beating heart of the Imperium's war machine, its forges running without cease, its manufactorums producing everything from simple las guns to the most complex plasma weapons and Volkite technology. But the Horus heresy would prove that even the Mechanicum was not immune to corruption and division. When War Master Horus turned against the Emperor and half the Space Marine legions followed him into rebellion, Mars itself became a battleground. The Schism of Mars saw the Adeptus Mechanicus split into loyalist and traitor factions, with the forces of the Dark Mechanicum embracing forbidden technologies and making pacts with the forces of chaos. During this conflict, some of those who turned traitor learned of the dragon beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus. They saw it as a weapon that could be used, a power that could be unleashed against the Emperor's forces. But the guardian of the dragon held firm. Dahlia Cythera, a young woman from Terra, whom the Emperor had chosen and transformed into a perpetual specifically for this duty, maintained the bindings even as war raged across Mars's surface. She was aided by Romu 31, an ancient Skitarii protector whose loyalty to the Emperor predated even the Treaty of Mars, a construct that might have been as old as the imprisonment itself. Together, they kept others away from the dragon's prison, ensuring that the Satan Shard remained contained, even as the Mechanicum tore itself apart above. The dragon slept through it all, its dreams perhaps disturbed by the psychic turbulence of the heresy, by the raw emotions of betrayal and hatred and zealotry that washed across Mars, but its bindings held. When the heresy finally ended, and the Emperor was interred upon the golden throne, when Horus lay dead and the traitor legions had fled to the Eye of Terror, the dragon remained where it had always been, in its prison of basalt and silver machines, dreaming its endless dreams of technology and perfection. The Void, dragon's influence through the ages. For 10,000 years after the heresy, the Imperium has endured, a sprawling realm of 1,000,000 worlds held together by faith, by the Astronomican's light, and by the vast industrial output of the Forge worlds. And through all those millennia, the Void Dragon has continued to dream beneath Mars, its influence shaping the Adeptus Mechanicus in ways both subtle and profound. The tech priests who worship the machine god do not know that their deity is, in a sense, real. An actual being of immense power whose unconscious emanations inspire their reverence for technology. They do not know that their prayers and rituals, while serving practical purposes in the maintenance of ancient machines, also serve to reinforce the psychic barriers that keep the dragon imprisoned. The Mechanicum's famous rigidity, their resistance to innovation, and their reverence for STCs and archaeotech can be understood in this context as both a religious imperative and a practical necessity. True innovation, radical departures from known designs, might risk disturbing the dragon's dreams, might introduce concepts or technologies that could weaken the bindings. Better to preserve and maintain, to worship the ancient and proven, rather than risk the new and unknown. The Omnissiah teaches that the machine spirit is sacred, that ancient designs are holy, that innovation without understanding is tech heresy. These teachings, while sometimes frustrating to outsiders who see the Mechanicum as hidebound and reactionary, serve to keep the tech priests working within parameters that the Guardian of the Dragon and the Emperor, before his internment, deemed safe. But the dragon's influence is not entirely benign or safely controlled. Over the millennia, there have been incidents that suggest the Satan's power, even bound and suppressed, can still affect the world above in unpredictable ways. Tech priests, who spend too long in meditation near the Noctis Labyrinthus, sometimes report visions that go beyond the normal dreams of machines and designs. They see stars being consumed, worlds reduced to raw materials, civilizations falling before armies of silver warriors. They wake screaming about necrodermis and tesseract labyrinths, about gods of living metal and wars that burned across the galaxy millions of years before humanity existed. Most dismiss these as hallucinations brought on by radiation or mental stress. A few dig deeper, seeking the source of these visions, and those individuals sometimes disappear, taken quietly by the Guardian or by agents who serve the same purpose, removed before they can uncover truths that must remain hidden. Then there are the Necrons themselves, the ancient enemies of all organic life, who have been awakening from their tomb worlds across the galaxy. In 998 on M41, 5 Necron Shroud-class light cruisers appeared in the Sol system and launched what appeared to be a suicidal attack on Mars itself. They penetrated the planet's formidable defenses through a combination of stealth technology and sheer determination, making for the northern regions where the Noctis Labyrinthus lay. Imperial and Mechanicum forces pursued them, engaging in desperate battles as the Necron vessels dove toward the surface. 4 of the 5 cruisers were destroyed, torn apart by defense lasers and interceptor fire. 1 managed to land on Martian soil before being vaporized. The Necron's objective in this attack has never been definitively determined. Official Imperial records list it as simply another example of Xenos aggression, a failed raid that cost the Necrons 5 valuable ships for no apparent gain. But those who know the truth about what lies beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus have other theories. Were the Necrons attempting to reach the Void Dragon? Were they trying to free it, to reclaim a shard of their former master, or were they trying to destroy it, to finish what their ancient revolt had begun millions of years ago? The answer remains unknown, but the fact that they targeted the specific region of Mars where the dragon sleeps cannot be coincidence. There have been other incidents as well, though fewer details are available about most of them. During the War of the Beast in M32, when the massive greenskin assault threatened the very existence of the Imperium, there were reports of unusual activity on Mars, of tech priests claiming to receive visions of ancient weapons that could turn the tide of the war. Some of these visions proved accurate, leading to the rediscovery of archaeotech that had been forgotten for millennia. Were these genuine insights granted by the machine god? Or was the dragon's consciousness responding to the threat facing humanity, offering knowledge in its dreams, because it understood that if the Imperium fell, its own prison might be breached or destroyed? The relationship between the dragon and the Mechanicum is, in many ways, symbiotic, though neither party would use that term. The dragon needs the tech priests to maintain the machinery that keeps it imprisoned, to reinforce the bindings through their rituals and their belief. The tech priests need the dragon's dreams to maintain their technological edge, to preserve knowledge that would otherwise be lost, to continue functioning as the industrial heart of the Imperium. It is a parasitic relationship in some ways, an imprisonment in others, but also a partnership of sorts, however unwilling and unequal. The Guardian of the Dragon continues their eternal vigil, though who currently holds that position is unknown to all but a few. The role is passed on in secret, each Guardian training their successor, ensuring that the knowledge and the responsibility are never lost. These Guardians live lives of profound isolation, cut off from the mechanicum they help to shape, unable to share what they know or even fully explain their purpose. They are the unsung heroes of the Imperium in a very real sense, for without their constant efforts, the bindings on the dragon would weaken and eventually fail. And if the Void Dragon were to wake, if it were to break free from its prison, the consequences would be catastrophic beyond measure. Theories, mysteries, and the question of what comes next. Despite everything we have discussed, vast uncertainties remain about the Void Dragon, its imprisonment, and what the future might hold. The accounts we have are fragmentary, contradictory, and filtered through layers of myth and unreliable narration. The Guardian of the Dragon themselves admits that the memories they access might not be entirely accurate, that the dragon's recollections are confused and fragmentary, colored by its alien perspective and the trauma of its shattering and imprisonment. So let us examine what is uncertain, what is speculated, and what questions remain unanswered. First, we must ask, is the entity imprisoned beneath Mars actually the Void Dragon, or merely a shard of it? The distinction is crucial. If it is the Void Dragon itself, the majority of Magladroth's power and consciousness concentrated in one place, then it represents one of the most powerful entities in the galaxy, a being that could potentially rival the Emperor himself in raw capability. If it is merely a shard, one fragment among many, then its power is reduced accordingly, though still immense by any reasonable measure. The evidence suggests it is a shard, given that the Necrons shattered all the Citan during their revolt, but it could be an unusually large shard, perhaps even the core fragment that contains the majority of the Void Dragon's original consciousness. Second, we must consider the Emperor's true motives in imprisoning the dragon rather than destroying it. Was it purely pragmatic, a decision based on the value of the dragon's knowledge and the difficulty of fully destroying a Citan, or was there a deeper purpose? Some have speculated that the Emperor intended from the beginning to use the dragon's dreams to shape the Mechanicum, that he foresaw the need for a technologically sophisticated ally in his future plans, and engineered the entire cult Mechanicus through the dragon's influence. If this is true, it demonstrates a level of long-term planning and manipulation that is staggering even by the Emperor's standards. It would mean he fought and imprisoned the dragon not centuries, but potentially millennia before the Unification Wars, all in preparation for events he foresaw in the distant future. There is also the question of what would happen if the dragon were to escape or be freed. Would it seek vengeance against the Emperor and humanity? Would it attempt to reclaim its former power and resume its ancient role as a Citan? Or has its long imprisonment changed it, given it time to reflect on its existence and perhaps altered its goals? The dragon was always the most enigmatic of the Citan, the one most associated with creation and technology rather than simple destruction. Some have theorized that if freed, it might not automatically seek to destroy humanity, but might instead attempt to enslave or reshape the species, to turn humanity into a new version of the Necrons, immortal servants working in perfect coordination to build monuments to the dragon's glory. The connection between the dragon and the machine god also raises theological questions that the Mechanicum itself is deeply divided on. If the machine god is real and is in fact the Void Dragon or is inspired by it, what does that mean for the religious beliefs of the tech priests? Are their prayers and rituals valid worship of a genuine deity, or are they the unwitting veneration of a bound prisoner? Does it matter whether the source of their inspiration is divine or alien, so long as the practical results are the same? These questions have led to conflicts within the Mechanicum, with different factions holding different positions on the nature of the Omnissiah and the Machine God, and their relationship to both the imprisoned dragon and the Emperor. There is also the matter of whether the Emperor himself is still maintaining the bindings from his position on the Golden Throne. The dragon's prison was designed to be self-sustaining, but the Emperor's direct psychic might was likely part of the original containment. With the Emperor now confined to the Golden Throne, his attention divided among countless other duties, the psychic drain of maintaining distant prisons across the galaxy, can those bindings still hold at full strength? Or are they slowly weakening, decaying over the millennia, until one day they will fail and the dragon will wake? The Guardian can maintain the physical systems, can monitor the prison and make repairs, but they cannot replace the Emperor's direct power if that power is no longer being applied. Some of the more radical members of the Inquisition and the Mechanicum have suggested that perhaps the dragon should be freed intentionally under controlled circumstances to serve as a weapon against the greater threats facing the Imperium. The Tyranids are devouring worlds at the galaxy's rim. The forces of chaos grow stronger with each passing year. The Necrons are awakening across the galaxy. Compared to these existential threats, the risk of releasing the dragon might seem acceptable if it could be turned against the Imperium's enemies. But such suggestions are quickly silenced. For those who know the true nature of the Citan, understand that they cannot be controlled, only contained. To free the dragon would be to unleash a force that might destroy the enemies of the Imperium, but would certainly turn on humanity once those enemies were gone. Looking to the future, we can identify several possible scenarios for how the situation with the Void Dragon might resolve. In the first and most optimistic scenario, the bindings hold indefinitely, or at least until such time as humanity has evolved beyond its current form and no longer needs the Mechanicum or the technological insights the dragon provides. The dragon remains imprisoned. Its dreams continue to inspire innovation within safe parameters, and the Guardian continues their eternal vigil. This is, essentially, the status quo, and while it is not without risk, it is the scenario that has held for 10,000 years and might hold for 10,000 more. In the second scenario, the bindings fail gradually, and the dragon begins to wake. Perhaps this has already begun, with the Necron incursions and the strange visions reported by tech priests near the Noctis Labyrinthus serving as early warning signs. If detected early enough, steps could be taken to reinforce the prison, to re-establish the bindings before the dragon fully regains consciousness. This would require the involvement of the Imperium's most powerful psychers, and possibly the direct intervention of the Emperor himself, which might not be possible given his current state. It would be a crisis that could reshape the entire Imperium, but one that could potentially be resolved without catastrophic losses. In the third scenario, the dragon escapes completely, breaking free from its prison and emerging onto the Martian surface. This would be an apocalyptic event for Mars and potentially for the entire Imperium. Even a single shard of the Void Dragon, freed and fully awakened, would be virtually unstoppable by conventional forces. It could consume the bioenergy of everyone on Mars, turning billions of tech priests, Skitarii, and servitors into lifeless husks. It could take control of the Forge World's manufacturing capabilities, turning the Mechanicum's own weapons against the Imperium. It could reach out to other Necron forces, offering them alliance or domination. The only force that might be able to stop a freed Void Dragon would be the Emperor himself, and his ability to act directly from the Golden Throne is severely limited. In the fourth, and perhaps strangest scenario, the dragon is freed but does not immediately turn hostile. Perhaps its long imprisonment has changed it, given it perspective on its existence and its relationship with organic life. Perhaps it views humanity as the Necrontyr reborn, a species of flesh that might be worthy of its guidance rather than simple consumption. It might offer humanity a bargain, serve it willingly, and receive the full benefit of its technological knowledge, advancing to a level that would make the dark age of technology seem primitive by comparison. But the price would be steep, potentially requiring biotransference for all humanity, the transformation of the species into something no longer truly human. Such a bargain would divide the Imperium, with some seeing it as humanity's salvation and others as the ultimate betrayal of everything the Emperor fought to protect. The truth is that we cannot know which of these scenarios, if any, will come to pass. The future is not fixed, even for beings as powerful as the Emperor or the Void Dragon. What we can say is that the imprisonment of the dragon beneath Mars is one of the most significant secrets in the entire Imperium, a truth so dangerous that it is kept from even the highest levels of the Adeptus Mechanicus leadership. The tech priests worship the machine god, perform their rituals, and advance humanity's understanding of technology, all while being unknowingly influenced by the dreams of a sleeping star god. They are the heirs to a tradition that stretches back to the war in heaven, practitioners of arts that were ancient when humanity first looked up at the stars. And beneath it all, the dragon sleeps and dreams. It dreams of stars consumed and worlds reshaped. It dreams of the war in heaven and the betrayal of its Necron servants. It dreams of the Emperor, the being who bound it and imprisoned it, but could not bring himself to destroy it entirely. And perhaps, in its dreams, it plans for the day when the bindings finally fail, when the Guardian's vigilance is not enough, when the prison opens and it can emerge once more into a galaxy that has changed beyond recognition, but where the fundamental nature of matter and energy remains the same. On that day, if it comes, the Imperium will face a threat unlike any it has encountered before, a being that was already ancient when humanity's ancestors first descended from the trees, a god of the material realm that understands technology at a level no organic mind can match. Until then, the vigil continues. The Guardian watches, the bindings hold, and Mars turns in its orbit around the Sun, a red planet whose greatest secret lies buried beneath the labyrinth of night, dreaming dreams that have shaped 10,000 years of human history and will shape however many millennia humanity has left before the darkness finally consumes all. Conclusion: the legacy of an ancient battle. The story of the Emperor's battle with the Void Dragon is, in many ways, emblematic of the larger themes that define the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It is a tale of ancient powers far beyond human comprehension, of a history that stretches back millions of years, of secrets that shape the present in ways those living in it cannot fully understand. The tech priests of Mars pray to the machine god, never knowing that their god is real in a sense they could never have imagined, and that it lies imprisoned beneath their feet. The Imperium depends on the Mechanicum's industrial output, never realizing that this capability is built on a foundation of dreams emanating from a sleeping Satan. The Emperor, even in his current state upon the Golden Throne, keeps secrets that might undo everything he built if they were ever revealed. The battle itself, that ancient confrontation between Perpetual and Star God, between psychic might and material mastery, set in motion chains of causation that have echoed through the millennia. Without the imprisonment of the Void Dragon, there might have been no Cult Mechanicus, no Treaty of Mars, no Adeptus Mechanicus as we know it. The Emperor's gamble, to capture rather than destroy, to imprison and use rather than eliminate a threat entirely, defined much of what would follow. It was characteristic of his approach to problems, ruthlessly pragmatic, willing to use any tool or take any action that advanced his goals, confident in his ability to control forces that others would consider too dangerous to touch. Whether that confidence was justified remains an open question. The dragon has been imprisoned for millennia, perhaps for 10,000 years or more, and the bindings have held. But the galaxy is changing, growing darker and more dangerous with each passing year. The Great Rift has torn reality itself, and warp storms wash across the Imperium Nihilus. The forces of chaos grow bolder, the Tyranids press in from all sides, and the Necrons continue their great awakening. In such tumultuous times, can ancient prisons hold? Can bindings established in an age before the Imperium existed still contain a being of such power? These are questions without easy answers, and perhaps it is better that way. The uncertainty, the not knowing, is part of what makes the Warhammer 40,000 universe so compelling. We are given hints and fragments, legends and myths, and we must piece together what truth we can from the evidence available. What we can say with certainty is that the Emperor fought the Void Dragon, that he defeated it but could not destroy it, and that he imprisoned it beneath Mars, where its dreams would shape human civilization for ages to come. This was not a battle fought for glory or even survival in the immediate sense. It was a calculated move in a game that spanned millennia, a single action taken by a being who saw centuries into the future and planned accordingly. The cost of that action, the risk of keeping a Citan shard imprisoned rather than destroyed, is something the Imperium continues to pay, though most will never know it. And somewhere beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus, in a chamber of basalt lined with machines of silver, the Void Dragon dreams on, waiting for the day when the bindings fail, or for the day when it is needed, when the Imperium's desperation becomes so great that even a sleeping god might be worth waking. Whether that day will come, whether the dragon will wake in fury or offer salvation, whether the ancient battle between Emperor and Citan will have a final chapter, none can say. But the story endures, passed down through the Guardians, whispered in the deepest vaults of the Mechanicum, hinted at in forbidden texts and classified imperial records. It is a reminder that the Imperium is built on foundations that most can never see, that the Emperor's grand design included contingencies and gambits that span timescales beyond mortal comprehension, and that sometimes the greatest threats are not the ones that rage across battlefields, but the ones that sleep beneath our feet, dreaming dreams that shape reality itself. So if you found this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40,000's greatest mysteries fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We explore the darkest corners of the grim darkness of the far future, uncovering the secrets and stories that make this universe so endlessly compelling. There's always more to discover in the lore of the 41st millennium, and we're here to guide you through it all. The Emperor protects, but knowledge is its own form of protection. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and remember, in the darkness of the far future, the truth is often stranger and more terrifying than any lie. Until next time, may the light of the Astronomicon guide your path, and may you never find yourself standing above the Noctis Labyrinthus when the dragon stirs in its sleep.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.